States and Israel and other countries have to live with every single day with their loved ones held in captivity. I believe very much that the death of Sinwar does create an important opportunity to bring the hostages home, to bring the war to an end, and to ensure Israel's security. And that's exactly what our conversations today focused on with our Israeli colleagues, including arrangements for the period following the end of the conflict. It's a conversation that I'll pursue in the region with other partners. But as the President said, this is, and we have to make sure that this is, a moment of opportunity to move forward. And that's the focus of all the conversations we're having here. We'll have an opportunity, I think, to speak more tomorrow at some point, as well as throughout the rest of this trip. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, President. Thank you.
Antony Blinken there, the US Secretary of State, meeting with the Israeli President Isaac Herzog there, saying that the death of Yahya Sinwar, former leader of Hamas, was, in his words, an important opportunity to end the war, bring the hostages home and give Israel security. And let's bring in Ryan Bohl, who's a senior Middle East analyst at RANE, a private intelligence forecasting firm. Ryan, good to see you. First of all, your thoughts on what we heard there from Antony Blinken, that the death of Yahya Sinwar is an opportunity to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza. I was just wondering, do you think that opportunity still exists, or has it passed?
I'm not even sure that opportunity existed even after Sinwar's death. There's still a question of succession within Hamas. We don't know whether or not it's going to be someone who's more of a pragmatist or a hardliner who will be taking charge of the group, or whether or not the Israelis are willing to offer concessions in the aftermath of Sinwar's killing. If the Israelis are not willing to offer concessions, and if there's no pragmatist in charge of Hamas, that means that there's really no recipe for a ceasefire.
In which case, the original question still stands that we were going to ask you before we took Antony Blinken live there. What's the point of him being in the Middle East?
Well, this is the shuttle diplomacy that shows the United States is still actively engaged, and it's mostly for political optics ahead of the election coming up in November here in the United States. That's really what Blinken is doing. But there's also, of course, this aspect of coordination for Israel's impending strike on Iran. We don't know when that's going to take place, but the Americans would probably prefer it to take place after the election. But if it does take place beforehand, they want the Israelis to understand that they want it to be severely limited, something on military sites within Iran that limits the possibility of regional escalation. So while there is always talk of a ceasefire in Gaza, I suspect most of Blinken's visit is about coordinating that Israeli counterattack for the October barrage of missiles against Israel from Iran.
Yeah, so clearly that could derail the Kamala Harris's election campaign if Iran were to strike Israel. But equally, we're talking about a US election here that is on really, really tight margins, and there's a significant Arab American vote that appear to be, if they're going to vote for anyone, they're going to vote for Jill Stein based on what Joe Biden or the behavior of Joe Biden's administration during the past year.
Yes, that's certainly another big political risk. And it's really a political unknown, too, because we don't know whether or not the polls are accurate as to whether or not this sentiment is enough to tip key states like Michigan. We do know that the Biden administration and the Harris campaign have concluded that it's more important to maintain the status quo with Israel than to pressure the Israelis in ways to win back these votes, which they're not convinced are necessarily there, or they're not convinced are necessarily enough to tip the final election. So that's their calculation. We certainly know what the White House thinks, but we don't know how the electorate is going to behave in this certainly unprecedented election in 2 weeks.
Yeah. What's your view on how to resolve what is happening in the Middle East, if indeed there is any way to resolve it?
I don't think that there's a quick way to resolve it. It does look like the Americans are taking the stance that they're going to allow the combatants to exhaust themselves, from a morale standpoint, political standpoint, economic standpoint, and eventually they'll de-escalate on their own terms. And they are gambling that they can do so without causing the things that impinge on a core American interest in the region, which are trade and energy, and of course terrorism as well. If those three areas aren't affecting ordinary Americans, Washington is believing that it can allow Iran, Israel, Hezbollah, Hamas, all of them to fight it out until somebody is willing to offer concessions to the others. But it looks like, at least for the next few months, maybe even for the next year, these combatants are more than willing to continue fighting, and they will continue to do so unless there's some sort of outside intervention by a country like the United States.
I was talking to one American voter at the weekend who said she's voting for Jill Stein. She doesn't believe that if Donald Trump wins the election or if Kamala Harris wins the election, it won't make a blind bit of difference to how Israel behaves in the Middle East. Do you share that view? Or do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu is more likely to listen to someone like Donald Trump or indeed Kamala Harris?
Well, certainly there would be a better relationship between Trump and Netanyahu, and that could translate into a few things. Certainly, we are talking more and more about the idea that the Israelis may try to resettle the Gaza Strip. I tend to think that that is more likely under a Donald Trump presidency, in large part because Trump had such a strong pro-Israel policies during his administration from 2017 to 21. In addition, the far right within Israel very much wants a Trump administration in order to set up those settlements. They believe that a Trump White House wouldn't sanction them, wouldn't attempt to block it, and would enable those sort of policies to establish their illegal outposts that they've done throughout the West Bank. They believe that under a Trump administration, that'd be more likely to be successful in Gaza. On the other hand, there's probably a fair bit of continuity between the two presidential candidates. Both of them are focused, of course, on energy security, on trade security, on the security of American forces throughout the region. And that does suggest that both of them are going to be looking for unique policy paths to end this conflict as part of their first year's agenda. Now, whether or not they're willing to do what really needs to be done, which is substantial pressure on the Israelis to de-escalate, that remains to be seen. But I do think there's also an argument to be made that the Trump administration, being as erratic as it was during its first term, may be willing to take unorthodox pressure measures against the Israeli government that we haven't seen in many decades.
Sorry, when you say unorthodox pressure measures, what do you mean by that?
Well, certainly they could do things like threatening military aid. They could be attempting to threaten behind closed doors that economic aid could change. We could see that the Trump administration could come out expansively and say something like, "We demand a ceasefire right now," and if Israel doesn't, as we've seen before with the Trump tweets that demand things that are kind of hard for actors to do, but nevertheless shake up and change their behavior. Trump has very much said that he wants the war to end. He thinks the Israelis should have ended it a long time ago. Now, whether or not that translates into immediately forcing the end of the war is an open question. But I do think that that instability in his approach will be there.
That would be fascinating. Ryan, really good to get your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Ryan Bohl there, Senior Middle East Analyst at RANE.